Hi, you're listening to Pop-Up Podcasting. We make podcasting easy, so stick around for tips, tricks, and a behind-the-scenes look at the podcast industry. Hi, I'm Lisa, and in this episode, JP, Will, Richard, and I discuss our personal experience with narrative-style podcasting, how to stay organized, and the importance of planning. We have a lot of internal podcasts that we do that it seems like are related to people who are doing it more for marketing. Would that make sense? Like not necessarily marketing like a product, but as part of I was reading some article recently that made it sound like podcasting is the new thing every business has to do. Like it's now part of their social.
I think I wrote that article. that sounds great. Whoever wrote that's a genius. No.
But you know what I mean? Like it's so that's what I think we're experiencing more. Mm. But let's say that we have then someone who is more of an artist and is a writer. And so maybe they're looking at it more from a perspective of, I could try to make a movie, or I could do a podcast. Like I could do something creative that in their case, there'd be maybe more pros because they're already comparing it to something larger that they can try to do, versus if they want to just be like, hey, I just want to make something creative and go from there. So in like a long-winded way to get around that, let's say someone's like, hey, I want to do this. I want to move ahead with it. Then we start to consider, or get into the considerations of how do they do that? So like structure, organizing, scripting, all of that. When I was working on the Strata one, so Strata, how to describe it? It was supposed to be a live play that was going to, or had premiered already, but was part of what was it called, JP? Do you remember the type of festival?
It was a theater festival, but I can't remember the name.
Yeah. So during COVID, instead of it being able to be performed live, I guess anybody who had been involved that was supposed to be performing that year was going to be turning their shows into like a more of a podcast, kind of like a play format, but recorded. So it ended up being, instead of one play, it ended up being a three-part play in audio format. And so in their case, they had a sound designer, they had a script, and they had also a separate script from the writer with different notes related to that. And I realized early on when I started downloading all the sound effects and the different music that this was going to be, I think there was something like 26 scenes maybe, that, I'm just like pulling it into my file folders like loose. And I'm like, this is not going to work. So then I start having to like make a folder for every single scene just so that it doesn't start to look like chaos. So I guess that's one example of organizing that helped.
Yeah, I think in the past, like even through some assignments with school and everything like that, where you're sort of building that narrative, I know the sort of like formula that I had gone through is, I guess it's different if like you just have like a client sending you stuff versus like how involved in the initial process you are. But like you have your raw audio, those, whatever the person's answers or whatever you're trying to capture, you crop that into the, the segments you actually want to focus on. You then can rearrange that into whatever, as you're starting to craft your narrative, where everything fits into place. And then I would usually like, once I have identified my clips, then you can like build your narration kind of around that sort of thing to like fill in the gaps in between the two and like connect everything. And then once you have that, you can sort of get into adding your music and your, sound effects and all that. But yeah, it was that process of doing your interviews, finding your clips you like, connecting it with your narration. Kind of, hopefully in your preparation, you've already identified that sort of emotional touch point you want to, because I think generally with narrative style ones, it's based on emotion, usually connecting in some way on an emotional level. So yeah, you identify what you want to sort of, what angle you want to take, do your interview, find those clips that work, weave your narration through, and then, yeah, you can really elevate it with those extra elements afterwards. So that was, I don't have a ton of experience with it, but that was sort of the process I did. And it was a lot of fun. Like it's very different than, sort of a lot of the stuff we do on the day to day, but it's nice sort of building out that narrative a little bit more. I think it'd be something, interesting to get into. But as we discussed, I don't know how it's such an investment that like, Lisa, when you worked on the Strata one, like how much of your time sort of was that taking up?
It took up I know it took over 70 hours over the course of a few months.
Like if we had like
it's okay.
It took a while, but it was super. I thought it was a super cool project and sounded like really great at the end. Like I thought it was super cool.
That's also like, so 70 hours over 2 months, and you didn't do all the work,
no,
right?
Not even like close.
They handed you all the, sound design. I mean, you had to arrange it and mix it, but that was all done. The script was all done. You didn't do any interviews. You did the recording of the actors, obviously, but like, it's mind boggling how much time and how big a team would be involved in some of these larger narrative podcasts.
Mm-hmm. I just want to go back to one thing. Like when we were doing this kind of thing in school, we had to write out the script for the entire thing. And at the time it felt a bit tedious. But now looking back, that was a really valuable exercise, because if someone was making a more narrative driven podcast, writing everything out and having that scripting would actually be, I would think, really, it's really helpful, because you kind of, in doing that, you sometimes just visually can also see like what things work and don't work and what can stay and go. And so I found that really helpful.
And like realistically too, like if you're trying to like make a good narrative, like that doesn't come off the cuff usually, I would say. Like I think more prep and thought needs to go into it. So yeah, no, I think having everything scripted and really being really thoughtful about the process is, I would say, a must when going into it. Yeah.
When I was thinking about this episode, because Lisa provided us some idea of what we would be talking about today, I thought of this quote, and I had to look it up because I can never remember quotes properly. But in terms of that kind of structuring and planning and organizing that goes into these narrative style podcasts, it made me think of this quote that, as it turns out, is from Abraham Lincoln, which I didn't realize, but it's, if I only had an hour to chop down a tree, I would spend the first 45 minutes sharpening my axe. Mm-hmm. And despite not being a huge follower of Abraham Lincoln, I think about that quote a lot, because it is like this kind of thing where, Lisa, you talked about Strata and the 70 hours that went into putting that together. If you had been less organized and done less planning and just been like, I'm just going to dive in and try to muddle through, it probably would have taken even longer, right? But you put in some time in the early stages of like, okay, I got to get organized. And that helps.
There's another way to look at that quote, though, in this, like, I completely agree. Like, that's a great quote. But in the sense also, like, Lisa, when you were working on Strata, like, you were the axe at some point. So the more you do it, the sharper you would get. And it wouldn't take you 70 hours after you do 4 of these. It might take you 60. And then after that, it might take you 50. So the more someone does these things, the better they get. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely why there are, these huge companies that do nothing but radio dramas. I mean, their producers do this every day. So it's, that's another aspect to it is, you get better and better as you work on it. Even you, Lisa, I'm sure by the end of Strata, you felt a lot more comfortable than when you first started.
Yeah, no, when I first started going in, I definitely took more of an approach of like, okay, I need to know as much as I can know going into it. So luckily, I had been provided with the recorded version of the stage play. So in a lot of cases, I was referencing the notes from the sound designer and the notes from the director/writer, and then also the play. Like all 3 of those things for every scene after having listened to the live performance, I think at least twice. So yeah, maybe that's a bit more of like what JP was referring to with the sharpening the axe. Like I think I was much better prepared because I was really trying to understand everything before starting the work on each scene, which maybe some people would see as a waste of time, or, because it felt like in those cases, it felt slow because I'm not just diving into being like, yeah, I think I can figure this out based on like somebody's notes. To me, it was like, no, I have to understand this scene really well and then go into it and try to recreate it, because that's essentially what the task was.
The preparation side also reminds me of pre-interviews and all the work that happens, before you before you hit record, really. I think a lot of these narrative style podcasts, there's a lot of front loaded work before any audio stuff starts to happen. It's like, is there a story here? What is the story? I better talk to like a bunch of the people involved and see if they're willing to talk to me and if they say things that are going to move the narrative forward and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if you guys had time, during those school assignments to do pre-interviews, but typically you would, because again, like these narrative style podcasts are like Marvel movies, right? And you're gonna make sure your script or your plan or your outline or whatever is really solid before you, start spending millions of dollars on actors or whatever.
We know what JP's favorite types of movies are now. Marvel.
You can check too if it's obviously some people this isn't applicable to, but if the person you're considering has done other interviews or, has a blog or whatever, some sort of presence online, you can always do some research that way as well too, to sort of see like how they sort of talk about themselves even, or like people in their industry and stuff like that. Can be good for background also.
Yes, definitely. That's a good point. You can just watch other people's interviews they've been in a lot of times, and that can basically tell you a lot of what you need to know.
Yep.
I'm always curious about I haven't really worked on like a multi-episode narrative, but it's a big investment on the part of the interviewees. Like, I think part of that pre-interview process must be like, is it cool if I interview you for like 20 hours and come hang out with you and you share like, the personal recordings you might have around this topic and blah, 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 blah. Because like this person is going to become a part of your life for a period of time if you're making one of these.
I think they probably do even contracts. Like if you were doing let's say a documentary about a specific person, you probably have to have tons of like legal help getting that all set up first.
I listened to one where I think it was called Missing Richard Simmons. And just, I don't know if everyone knows who Richard Simmons is.
I listened to a bunch of that.
Yeah,
but that one was that one was an interesting one though. And it got into a little bit of controversy because he didn't he was a fan of Richard Simmons and stuff, but it ended up sort of being like, is he just invading his like space now? Because like Richard Simmons retreated from his public life and this person was basically investigating why, but it was like, well, he just doesn't want to be, so it was sort of about him, but without his consent and everything like that. I don't know. And he was also
unauthorized documentary.
Sort of. Yeah. And it I know the conversation it sort of sparked was like, for like celebrities and stuff is it, can they just retreat into private life? Do they need to, explain themselves or anything like that? And it was sort of, I talked about whether he crossed a line with it or not, but that was definitely an interesting style narrative one. That's funny. A couple of us have listened to it too.
Thanks for checking out Pop-Up Podcasting, podcasting made easy. If you're interested in learning more about podcasting or starting your own podcast, you can find us at popuppodcasting.ca, where you can download our free guide, Podcasting at Work.